Let's understand logical operators in JavaScript. First of all, let's imagine we have an age that is basically equal to 17, for example. And now you can use logical operators basically everywhere. But oftentimes you use them within an if statement, so we are going to do exactly that. So let's imagine we have an if statement and we want to check whether the age is greater than 18, for example. So we can say if age is greater than 18, but now let's also imagine we want to know whether our person is under the age of 25, for example. And now we can, for example, use an AND operator. So basically using two AND symbols, and this is a logical AND connection. So now we can also say if age is greater than 18 and if age is less or equal than 25, for example. And now we can console.log whatever, for example, doesn't really matter, to be honest. And now once you run the code and let's say our person is 19, for example, we are going to get whatever, because that's what we just logged inside of the console, if the user is between 18 and 25. And now you could obviously connect as many things as you want to. So you could obviously also say and name equals whatever, but obviously this doesn't make sense in our case. And if you work with logical operators, it's basically just like using normal language. You can just read it like normal language if you write your code in a good way. So if our age is greater than 18 and our age is less than 25 or less than equal than 25. And the same works basically with the OR operator. So instead of and, we can also say or, for example. So if our age is greater than 18 or if our age is less than 3, for example, less or equal than 3. So now we can also say, okay, our person is 4, we will basically get nothing in the console. So let's also say now he's 2, for example. Now we're going to run the code and now we get whatever in the console because the person is not older than 18, but he's less or equal than 3. So if you use the AND operator, both of these statements have to be true because you use AND. If you use the OR operator, just one of those statements has to be true. Now you can obviously also use the NOT operator. So let's imagine we are having a variable that is married and that variable is true, for example. So if we want to, for example, check whether our person is married, so is married is equal to true, and instead of this syntax you can also just say if is married. And this would be equal to saying is married is equal to true. So if our person is married, we are going to console.log whatever. And as you can see, we are console.logging whatever. But right now, let's say we want to console.log whatever if our person is not married. And you can do so by using the not operator. So this exclamation mark is the not operator and just reverses the value that is basically there. So obviously if we are checking for a person that is basically not married and we run the code, we are not getting whatever because our person is not married. But once we say our person is not married, so is married is false and we're going to run the code, we are getting whatever in the console again. Now there are two more operators that are really important and often forgotten, and one of them is the nullish and one of them is the optional operator. So let's imagine we basically have a user. So we are going to create let username be equal to null, for example. And now we are going to console.log our username and we're going to see what we see in the console. And as you can see, we are seeing null. And now you can use the nullish operator to give the fallback value for this username. So if the username is null, for example, let's say he is just called Sven, for example. And now we're going to log the username again. And now we see Sven on the console because if the first value is null or undefined, let's take a look and show you that this works as well. So if the first value is null or undefined, we are basically using Sven as a fallback for the username. And this is especially useful if you work with databases later on and you, for example, have some values where the user does not have to enter a value. So maybe he doesn't have to enter his age. And now if you just have undefined for the age, it's probably not that good for your app. And you want to display an age or say, hey, you didn't enter an age, for example, whatever. Could be a case. And then you have a fallback text that could, for example, say you didn't enter an age, for example, like enter an age, like so. And now you could, for example, say let age be either equal to whatever you get from the database, could be something you enter here. And if it doesn't enter anything, you would obviously get undefined. And then you have this as a fallback text. So this would be a real case scenario. And now let's also say, let's username just be equal to null. So we're getting this null value. And now we are going to console.log our username. So now let's say we want to log our username inside of the console. We're going to run the code and we're getting null inside of the console. So now let's say we want to log username.text inside of the console, and we're going to log this. And as you can see, we are getting an error because username does not exist. So obviously the property text does also not really exist because username is null and .text doesn't even exist. So now we can use the question mark to check only if the username really exists. We're going to look for the text property basically. So let's just run the code again, and as you can see, we're now just getting undefined because we don't have a text property and our username is null. And if you think about a database again, it makes sense if you get a lot of null values, for example, that you first check whether there even exists this property, and if it exists, you can obviously use the value, and if it doesn't exist, you're just going to interrupt the code and return undefined, which obviously makes your code a lot more error prone.